Hey, welcome back everybody, it's Timothy here with Mana Rocks, and we are going to roll right into part 2 of our Theros Beyond Death archetype breakdown. We are looking at 2 color pairs per video, and kind of just giving you a snapshot of what that color pair is trying to do within the limited format. Whether draft or sealed, we're going to be looking at the main headliners, the cards that let you or push you to move into a given archetype, and then we'll look at the synergy cards that really make it tick on top of the rares that make that you open up and really want to play. We're also going to look at some rares that don't really match the theme of the color pair. It's kind of weird, some of them are in this set where the multicolor rares are kind of off theme with the actual color pair, but we're still going to mention them just because they are going to play better in, the given archetype. They're just not really splash worthy cards for the most case. But this time I figured since we started with blue black and blue red, we would move into some non-blue colors and look at green red and white red this time, which are going to be a little bit more aggro strategies than the kind of dirtily control strategies we saw in the previous video. So again, thanks for watching, thanks for joining us here. And I hope this provides some sort of help for you if you're attending pre-releases or drafting for the first time. You can let me know in the comments below if you like this sort of format for the reviews. If this was helpful, please let me know. And find us on Twitter at MTG_ManaRocks. And with that being said, let's go ahead and jump into green red, which we're calling this ferocious, but it's 4 power matters. Basically, you are going to be drafting 4 power creatures, or creatures with 4 or greater power, and you're going to be drafting the cards that specifically get better when you have 4 power creatures. This is a little bit of a loose archetype in that you can just draft green-red beatdown and not necessarily care about the theme just because there are big creatures in this format. Green gives you big creatures, red gives you solid removal. Green also has some solid removal as well, and you just combine those together and beat your opponent down. You don't have to care too much about the curving one of the 4 power matters cards into a 4 power creature, but that is the main theme of the color pair, so we'll go ahead and look at your payoffs here. The first one are gold uncommon. Again, we'll try to start each archetype with the gold uncommon because it is kind of your signpost, right? It's your typical design that the gold uncommon in a color pair tells you what the color pair is trying to do, and I think Warden of the Chained does a pretty good job of that. It's 1 green red for a 4/4 trample. It's a 3 mana 4/4, which is pretty above rate. This set doesn't have a lot of huge creatures, so getting anything above rate seems like it's just going to be solid in this set. And it has a downside. It says it can't attack unless you control another creature with power 4 or greater. So there you go, right off the bat. This archetype cares about having 4 power creatures. If you have 2 of these on board, they kind of work with each other, but it can still block, right? It's a 3 mana 4/4 trampler that sometimes can't attack but can always block, and that's fine, right? That's going to hold down the 4 and keep your opponent off your back while you can find a 4 power creature. And once you do find a 4 power creature, then you get to start bashing, right? There, I don't think are any 4 power creatures that come down before turn 3, like no 2 power or 2 mana 4 power dudes or anything like that. But it's not too hard to drop this on turn 3 and then follow up with a 4 mana 4/4 or something like that, which there are plenty of, and just start bashing with this card. So this is your beatdown card. It's a card that's not really splashable outside of this archetype too, so if you're the only red-green drafter at a table, you should be able to get hooked up with this card, and I can see a deck having multiples of this. A lot of these golden commons are just good enough to go in other decks if you have the mana fix-in, but I don't think Warden of the Chain really fits that bill, so you can get hooked up with this card, and it's a pretty sweet one if you're in the archetype. Next up is an enchantment. This is Furious Rise, 2 and a red for an uncommon, and it says at the beginning of your end step, if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, exile the top card of your library. You may play that card until you exile another card with Furious Rise. So this is a little interesting. First off, this is a definite payoff, or a build around, if you will. You absolutely have to have 4 power creatures and an abundance of them in your deck before this is even a playable card, because it doesn't trigger at all if you don't have a 4 power creature. If you just play this on turn 3, you have no creature on board, it does nothing, right? Even if you follow up with a 4 power creature on turn 4, it doesn't really do anything until the turn after, because you're not going to be able to cast that card that you exile on the end step if you're tapping out for your 4-power creature. It's also pretty easy to shut off. Whereas something like Warden of the Chain still works on defense if your opponent kills your 4-powered creatures. The Furious Rise doesn't do anything, so it's a little bit awkward. Your opponent can snipe down. If a removal heavy deck can take you off of 4-power creatures, they can mitigate the power of Furious Rise too. What this card does, though, let's say you consistently have 4-power creatures, is it basically gives you a free card every turn, or at least access to a free card every turn. And if you happen to flip a card that you can't use or can't cast, then you're allowed to, on the next end step, exile a different card, and the original card that you exiled, if you haven't played it yet, if you haven't cast it yet, that's just going to remain exiled forever. You no longer have access to it, but you get to flip into a different card, right? And you can play lands off of this too. It's a little bit awkward that this triggers during the end step, but on the following turn, you can play a land drop if you hit it, and then if you still have a 4-power creature by the end of that turn, you can flip this into another card. So if you think back to M20, I believe, it was M19. If you think back to M19, there was this card called Colossal Majesty, which was a 3-mana enchantment that said on your upkeep, if you control a 4-power creature, you get to draw a card. This is a little bit worse than that was, and that already wasn't an insane card, but this does give you a steady flow of cards in a color combination that's not going to have a lot of card advantage. So if you do draft around it, and you pick this up early, and you manage to just stuff a bunch of 4-power creatures into your deck, it should do solid work. And it is the type of card that really just kind of chains off of itself, where if you're able to maintain a steady stream of triggers with this card, you should be able to find more 4-power creatures and just get to keep dumping things on the board. So I like the card, but you definitely need to build around it to take advantage of it. Anax, Hardened in the Forge, is our red demigod. I don't think I mentioned this in the previous video, but there is a demigod at uncommon in each color, and they kind of have the same theme to them, where they're double color. So in this case, this one's red. This one happens to cost 3, some of them cost 2. And they have a star either in their power or toughness equal to your devotion to that color. So in the case of Anax, its power is equal to your devotion to red. So on its own, it's a 2/3, and any additional red symbols you have on board are going to add to its power. You'll see Anax in a couple of the other videos too, because this is probably one of the best uncommons in the entire set. If not the best uncommon, it's just really good. So what Anax does is it says, whenever Anax or another non-token creature you control dies, create a 1/1 red satyr creature token with this creature can't block. So that's already pretty good, right? Anax is sometimes going to be a 3 or a 4/3 for just 3 mana. It beats down, and if your opponent kills it, you at least replace it with something. A 1/1 that can't block isn't exactly an amazing card, but it lets you keep pressure on your opponent. Anax has an extra little bonus, though. It says, if the creature had power 4 or greater, create 2 of those tokens instead. And that includes Anax. Remember, this triggers when Anax himself dies. So if Anax had 4 power when he leaves the battlefield or when he dies, then you're going to create 2 of these tokens, and that happens for all of your other 4-power creatures as well. That means sometimes you can even just, if your opponent's going to go kill one of your small creatures, you can use a pump spell to bring it above 4 power and just get a couple tokens off of it. So it's a nice way to keep pressure on the opponent by making sure, A, you're playing big creatures, which have to be answered, right? And if your opponent does answer those, you get a bunch of little small creatures in exchange. Now, Anax does not necessarily have to be in green-red to be amazing. It's just a fantastic card in any red deck. We didn't mention it in a red-blue, but you're playing that card in red-blue. It's just great. And if you do happen to draft this in the 4 Power Matters archetype, in this Gruul archetype, it's just going to be completely busted some amount of the time. So it's a must-kill target that pays you off for it dying, and then also pays you off for your other big creatures dying, which to me seems like one of the best cards you can ask for this archetype. Elysian Caryatid is up next. It's 1 in a green for a 1/1. It's a common plant, because of course it is, and it's a mana dork. It says tap to add 1 mana of any color, or if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, you make 2 mana of any 1 color instead. So this is going to be, I think, a highly sought after card. There's not a lot of mana fixing in this set. In fact, there's not a lot of mana ramp either. Caryatid does both of those things. It mana fixes and it helps you splash while also ramping you ahead. And if you happen to have 4 power creatures on board, this can ramp you way ahead, right? So if you play this on turn 2 and then you follow up on turn 3 with a 4 power creature, you get to untap, play your land, and you have access to 6 mana on turn 4. And that's a pretty realistic scenario, right? Now, unlike a lot of other mana dorks that we've been getting recently, this one doesn't have a lot of power and toughness going on, so it's a pretty frail creature. It doesn't enable the strategy itself. It's more of a payoff for being in the strategy. So if you want this card, you're probably going to play it in any green deck, to be honest, but it does make you want 4 power creatures a little bit more. Like I said, though, this is going to be a card that basically any green deck will want, and they will want access to this card. So I wouldn't expect to get this one really late in packs if you're drafting, because it's just going to be good in basically any green deck, but it does give you an extra little boost for being specifically in green-red. Neshian Horn Beetle is 1 in a green for a 2/2. It's an uncommon insect. It says at the beginning of combat on your turn, if you control another creature with power 4 or greater, put a +1/+1 counter on Neshian Horn Beetle. So this is kind of a neat little payoff. It's uncommon, which to me seems a little bit bonkers, right? Because you need to trigger this, I guess, twice before it becomes an uncommon level card. The first trigger is nice, but you're probably not doing that until turn 3. But I guess attacking as a 2-mana 3/3 is pretty good. This is a curve out card that is actually pretty good in the late game, or rather as the game goes on. It's not something you want to top deck, but if it's been sitting around there since turn 2 and you've been able to follow up consistently with 4 power creatures, this is going to get bigger. And one neat thing about this is after 2 triggers, this itself is going to be a 4 power creature, which will help enable your other 4 power matters cards, right? It doesn't trigger off of itself, so you do have to enable it with other creatures. But by the time you have done that a couple times, this will start enabling the rest of the strategy too. So it's a nice curve creature. It's pretty poor late in the game if you do top deck it, since you're going to have to wait a couple turns for it to really catch up. But if you happen to play this on turn 2 and then follow up with a 4 power creature, I think it's going to be a pretty good beatdown card. Stampede Rider, basically another common to just kind of fill out this deck. Not an insane card, but a decent payoff for being in the color combination. Stampede Rider's 2 in a red for a 2/3. It's a common satyr with trample. So 3 mana 2/3 trample, not really a card I would bat an eyelash at, but it does say at the beginning of each combat, if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn. And notice that's each combat, so this will trigger on your opponent's turn as well, which makes it a decent attacker on top of a decent blocker. If you are consistently triggering this, it is going to be a 3 mana 3/4 trampler during combat, which is a pretty solid beatdown card. Not quite as resilient as the Horn Beetle as time goes on, but trample does give it a little bit of an extra edge, and it plays the blocking game a little bit better as it comes down. So not an insane card, but a card that you're probably happy to fill your deck out with if you end up in this strategy. So as far as enablers and synergy cards go, it's pretty straightforward, right? I figured instead of listing every single creature that makes this strategy work, I would just go ahead and give you a few numbers real quick. There are 8 commons in green and red that enable the 4 power strategy without any additional work. They just naturally have 4 power or more. There are 3 of them that are red creatures. They're all fairly expensive, 4 mana or more. And then there are 5 of them that are green creatures. Note that there's only 1 creature that you can cast on turn 3 that has 4 or more power without any work. Again, there are other creatures that aren't on this list that have escape. There are things like pump spells. There are auras floating around. So you can build your own creature that has 4 power or more. But these are the ones that just naturally have it if you cast it from your hand and you don't have to do any other work. Some of these cards are a little bit more exciting than others, but it just goes to show that this is a very well supported archetype, that if you are looking to find a 4 power creature, you should be able to find it pretty easily. And keep in mind, these are only the commons. There are plenty of other uncommons as well that fit the category. Of these, probably the best ones are Voracious Typhon, Nylea's Forerunner. Those are just really solid cards. Nylea's Huntmaster is also pretty good, but I didn't really want to read every single one of them, because if you are in this archetype, you're kind of just looking for a mass of 4 power creatures. You don't really want like a ton of Nyxborn Colossuses or Nyxborn Brutes, but you'll take the 3 and 4 mana creatures pretty highly. And some of them have downsides for blocking, like the Flummox Cyclops can't block if your opponent's attacking with 2 or more creatures. But remember, green-red is trying to be a beatdown deck, so you don't really care as much about blocking when you're drafting your deck as you do about attacking. And then there's things like Nylea's Forerunner that have trample and give all of your other creatures trample. So big payoffs for having just a mass of 4-power creatures. And again, this is just common level, so there's tons of them floating around. It shouldn't be too hard to enable this strategy if you get the payoffs to do so. Now, as far as the best rares for the archetype, again, I mentioned this at the beginning of the video, but I want to mention the cards that are on color rares or gold cards, even if they don't necessarily do what the archetype is intended for you to do. And in this case, Gallia of the Endless Dance is one of those cards. It's red-green for a 2/2. It's a rare satyr with haste. It gives your other satyrs +1/+1 and haste, which, you know, there aren't a ton of satyrs, but there are a couple floating around the set, so that matters, even though it's mostly trinket text. And it says, whenever you attack with 3 or more creatures, you may discard a card at random. If you do, draw 2 cards. This is a good just beat down curve card, right? If you can play this on turn 2 and start attacking, maybe you even get to follow up with a satyr or something like that. It's solid, right? No other satyrs in your deck. You're still playing this in your green-red deck. But the real reason I wanted to mention it is because it does not really match the theme of the set. So if you happen to be drafting for the first time, you haven't looked at the full spoiler, and you open Gallia of the Endless Dance and take the card, don't expect to move into like a green-red satyr deck, because it's not really going to be a thing, even if you pick up a couple other satyrs. So I'll mention this with other archetypes as well. If the gold, rare, or mythic doesn't match the theme of the set, I'm still going to mention the card, but it'll be kind of just a warning that that is not really what the archetype wants to be doing. Next up is Klothys, God of Destiny. This is a mythic rare, so you won't have to play with or against it very often, but it kind of matches what green-red wants to be doing on account of, you know, being a 4-power creature. Now, this one's a little bit interesting because if you've played with gods before, especially these 2-color gods from like Born of the Gods and Journey in the Nyx, they're not always creatures, right? So let's go ahead and read this just in case you've never played with those cards. It's 1 red and green for a 4/5 indestructible legendary enchantment god, and it says as long as your devotion to red and green is 7 or less, or is less than 7, Klothys isn't a creature. So your devotion to red and green needs to be 7 or greater in order for Klothys to be a creature, and while it's not a creature, it doesn't have any power or toughness on the board, so it won't enable those 4-power matters cards unless your devotion is 7 or greater. Note that Klothys does add her own devotion to herself, so you already have red and green for it on top of any other permanents you might control. The effect she gets, whether she's a creature or not, is at the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, exile target card from a graveyard. If it's a land, add red or green to your mana pool. Otherwise, you gain 2 life and it deals 2 damage to each opponent. So, again, that ability isn't really on theme for this Gruul archetype, but Klothys is, and Klothys is worth enabling. It's just a good beatdown card if you're able to flood the board with a bunch of permanents and get that devotion high. I just wanted to mention her here because she is the kind of archetypal mythic of the set, even though not every color gets 2 rares. Gruul did, and Klothys is more on theme than something like Gallia of the Endless Dance. I also wanted to mention the first Iroan Games. This is, again, just a green card that's going to be probably good in any green deck, but at its best in green-red. So it's 2 and a green for a Saga. The first chapter, so when it enters the battlefield, you will trigger chapter 1, which says create a 1/1 white human soldier creature token. So 3 mana for a 1/1 is basically what you're getting if this card goes away. Not good enough, but there are 3 other chapters. Remember, each chapter will trigger on your draw step after you've played this card. So you have to wait a full turn, and then you get to chapter 2 on your next draw step, which says put 3 +1/+1 counters on target creature you control. There you go. That alone will give you your 4-power creature. Granted, it won't do it until turn 4, but you can attack with that thing on turn 4. So you create the human when it comes in the battlefield, and if that's the only creature you control when it comes back around to chapter 2, you can make it into a 4/4. You can also throw the +1/+1 counters on a creature you already control, something with trample preferably. Chapter 3, which will happen the next turn, says if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, draw 2 cards. And that line is what makes this card better in green-red than any generic green deck or any other green deck, because you will just naturally have more creatures that are power 4 or greater. If you're playing this card as just a standalone card in, let's say, blue-green or something like that, your opponent can kill the creature with power 4 or greater by the time Chapter 3 rolls around, and basically Chapter 3 won't do anything. But in red-green, it's more likely that you just happen to have other creatures that are power 4 or greater. So if your opponent can't kill all of them by the time Chapter 3 rolls around, you're probably going to get your 2 cards. And then Chapter 4 says create a gold token, which is just an artifact like a treasure that can tap for mana. So Chapter 4 is more like a flavor trinket text there. But you really care about Chapter 2 and 3, producing a 4-power creature and then making sure by the time the Chapter 3 triggers that you still have a 4-power creature on board so that you can get your cards back off of this. Altogether, a pretty solid card that you're probably playing in any green deck, but going to be at its best in green-red. And that lets us move right on into white-red, which has a heroic sub-theme. So this is a little bit weird. They didn't bring back the heroic mechanic as a whole, which was basically the headliner of original Theros. A creature with heroic said whenever you target it with a spell or ability, you get some sort of bonus. But they kind of dumbed that down in this set. I guess they didn't want to commit fully to heroic as a full mechanic. So instead what they did was they gave the quote-unquote heroic mechanic to a subset of Boros creatures. And they all have the same ability. So we're going to see all those cards here. But basically, red-white cares about building out a board, making sure you go as wide as possible with tokens, small creatures, so on and so forth, and these hero creatures that we'll see. And then using targeted pump spells or just targeted spells in general to trigger those heroic abilities and turn your go wide board into basically a game swinging board. So let's go ahead and take a look at the heroic creatures that we actually have in the set, starting off with the gold uncommon, which is the best of the heroes. It's Hero of the Nyxborn, 1 red and a white, 3 mana for a 2/2. It's an enchantment creature. It's uncommon. It says when it enters the battlefield, create a 1/1 white human soldier creature token. So on its base, you're getting 3 mana for a 2/2 and a 1/1, which is on par, right? 3 mana for 3 power and 3 toughness worth of stats. And most importantly, that's spread off across 2 bodies. This archetype is going to care a lot about having cards that can make multiple creatures, and the uncommon fits perfectly for doing that. And then it has the heroic text that we're going to see on the next 4 cards as well. It says whenever you cast a spell that targets Hero of the Nyxborn, creatures you control get +1/+0 until end of turn. So that's already pretty decent on its own, because if you ever target this, you're pumping itself, plus you're pumping the human token that you made, in addition to pumping any other creatures you control. And that's going to be kind of the theme of the next couple cards. I think we can actually probably blast through the rest of these cards here, because they all kind of do the same thing with minor tweaks to the stat line. The next probably best one is Hero of the Winds. It's 3 and a white for a 1/4 uncommon human soldier. It has flying, and then it has the same heroic text. So if you ever cast a spell that targets it, all of your creatures get +1/+0. The reason I say this is probably the next best is because it does have flying. None of the other ones do. And adding that board pump on top of an evasive threat is just going to be better than having it on like a dorky ground creature, which are the 2 main commons. The other uncommon here is Heroes of the Revel. This is 4 and a red for a 4/4 uncommon satyr soldier. So 5 mana 4/4. It says when it enters the battlefield, you create a 1/1 red satyr creature token with this creature can't block. So that's pretty good. You're getting 5 power, 5 toughness worth of stats, spread out across 2 bodies, which we already said with Hero of the Nyxborn is kind of the name of the game here. Seems very solid. And then you have the heroic text, again, of pumping your team when you target it. You have next up Hero of the Games, which is one of the kind of dorky commons. And then we'll just look at the other one at the same time, Hero of the Pride. These two, respectively, are a 1 and a white 2/2 with the heroic ability, and then 2 and a red 3/2 with the heroic ability. And honestly, these cards are all basically not interchangeable, but the effects are the same, right? If you're looking for this effect, you can grab basically any of these cards, and they will fulfill the trick. So the uncommons are clearly better than the commons. The commons are kind of just curve fillers, but if you can amass all of these cards together into the same kind of deck, then you can really go off. And what you're looking for is ways to target multiple creatures with the same spell. But unlike Theros, this set is not really focused on combat tricks as much, so there actually aren't as many ways to target multiple creatures with the same card. We will look at 1 or 2, but if you're picking up the heroes and you see that this archetype is open, these are the 5 cards that you're looking for, starting with the uncommons and then using the commons as kind of secondary fillers. And then you're going to look for basically any way to make tokens or any way to pump your board. So let's go ahead and talk about this. Again, the enablers and the synergy cards for this archetype are going to be the cards that put multiple creatures on board or have ways to target multiple creatures. So Command and Presence is worth talking about. It's 3 and a white for an uncommon aura. It enchants a creature. That creature gets +2/+2 and has first strike, and whenever it deals combat damage to a player, create a 1/1 white human soldier creature token. So this is a little bit twofold. I'm not in love with auras that just pump power and give you some sort of effect, because there is efficient removal in this set, and it's asking for trouble, although the power level of this one might be justified if you can get a couple swings in, especially on the flyer. That's why the fly-in one is so important. But this is twofold, right? You get to, first off, target a creature by using this enchantment, so you get to trigger the heroic ability, and then on top of that, this can help build out a bigger board too if that creature is able to reliably get in by making 1/1 human soldiers. So again, not a card that I'm like clamoring for, but the power level is here, and this is the archetype that I think wants this card the most. There's Omen of the Sun. We haven't talked about a lot of the omens yet. And honestly, I won't, but they're pretty good cards in this set as far as just being enchantments with additional upside. Omen of the Sun is 2 and a white for a flash enchantment at common. When it enters the battlefield, you create 2 1/1 white human soldier creature tokens, and you gain 2 life, and then you can pay 3 mana to sack the Omen and scry 2. We don't care so much about that last ability, although it's nice little gravy on top of all of these omens. In this case, we care that we have a 3 mana card that just produces 2 1/1 bodies on board, which along with your heroic creatures is going to turn into additional damage. We have Reverent Hoplite, which seems like a key uncommon for this archetype. It is 4 and a white for a 1/2 uncommon human soldier. When it enters the battlefield, you make 1/1 human soldiers equal to your devotion to white. Reverent Hoplite already has 1 white in its mana cost, so that's going to be at least 1 human, assuming this survives for the trigger, and then you'll make a human for all of your other whites. So keep in mind, we just looked at Omen of the Sun, Command and Presence. These all give you white, additional white towards your devotion, so it shouldn't be too hard to play Reverent Hoplite and get 2, 3, 4 soldiers off of it. Sometimes you go way wider than that, and you're really looking to get about 3 soldiers off of this card before it becomes really good. Even at 2 soldiers, this is a justifiable inclusion in this deck, but make sure if you are drafting this deck that you're really looking for the white heroes as opposed to the red ones, and that you can maximize the devotion count so that you can turn that board into just a heroic sweeper for the opponent. Annex we just talked about in red-green, so we're not going to go over the full ability, but it is nice that this turns creatures that die into additional creatures, so it just gives you a reliable, steady board of creatures. Also, again, pays you off for having those 4 power creatures, which this deck can probably do. Red-white is often going to be able to get its creatures to 4 power or greater, even if it means expending some resources, and then Annex lets those creatures die off into additional creatures so that hopefully you can keep the heroic train moving after that. Satyr's Cunning is probably not a very good card, but it does fit this strategy, and I wanted to mention it because it is one of the few ways in this set that you can use the same card over and over to kind of amass a board. It's a single red mana for a common sorcery that makes a 1/1 red satyr that can't block. So 1 mana for a 1/1 that can't block, not particularly good. But the upside here is that it has Escape for 2 and a red. You exile 2 cards from your graveyard, and you can cast this card out of your graveyard. So for 3 mana and 2 cards from your graveyard, you can just produce a 1/1. Red-white doesn't care so much about recycling cards from its graveyard as a lot of the other archetypes will. So you can be pretty liberal with using the Escape on your red-white cards if you're in this archetype. And I think Satyr's Cunning will have a spot in this archetype, if not any other archetype. And it makes satyrs too, which might matter for your green-red guy or something like that. But for the most part, I would stay away from this card. But if you do find yourself in red-white, you've picked up a bunch of heroes, and you're just looking for a way to build out a board, Satyr's Cunning is a card that other people likely aren't going to be interested in, and you can pick one up late. Wrap in Flames is actually a very interesting card in this set. It's not super powerful. It's kind of like a blow your house down type effect if you played Eldraine. It's 3 in a red for a common sorcery. It deals 1 damage of each to each of up to 3 target creatures. Those creatures can't block this turn. So a lot of times you're just going to go target your 3 blockers, attack with everything. Sometimes that's enough to win you the game. So I usually like effects like this more than most people. Where it really falls behind is if you're not in a position to be attacking, then Wrap in Flames isn't really going to do that much unless that 1 damage is actually going to kill some creatures. But why I really like it in this format, and in this archetype in particular, is because you can target your own creatures with Wrap in Flames, and it is one of the few spells in this entire set that can target more than 1 creature off of a single spell. So I imagine having 2 heroic creatures on board, and you say Wrap in Flames, target one of your creatures, target your best creature so it can't block, and then target 2 of my heroic creatures, and I get 2 heroic triggers. So all my creatures now have +2/+0, and you're down a blocker. As long as that 1 damage isn't going to kill your creature, that seems like a pretty good play. Even you split it up differently, target one of your heroes and then target 2 of your opponent's creatures, that should give you an avenue to attack. So I think Wrap in Flames is going to be a respectable card in this format, and I think it's going to be at its best in red-white. There's also Phalanx Tactics, which seems like it could be busted in this archetype, if not just a really good playable card. It's 1 in a white for an uncommon instant. It says target creature you control gets +2/+1 until end of turn. Each other creature you control gets +1/+1 until end of turn. So I don't really need to spell it out, but I'm going to. If you target one of your heroic creatures on board, and this only targets 1 creature, even though it does pump your entire board, which is a neat design. If you target one of your heroic creatures, that creature is going to get +3/+1, and then all of your other creatures are going to get +2/+1, which means that you are just swinging for a bunch of damage. And this thing only costs 2 mana. I can see a deck that has like 2 of these and a couple heroic creatures, and you just win the turn you cast one of these spells, if you're able to build out a big enough board. So that's where the token synergies come in, because being able to give all of your creatures +2/+1, and on top of giving one of your creatures an even bigger bonus than that, seems pretty good to me. So Phalanx Tactics, probably not a card you likely want in a lot of your other white-based archetypes, since those are very much enchantment-based, but as far as red-white goes, this is the mass board pump you are looking for. And that brings us to the rares for the archetype, starting with Haktos the Unscarred. It's red, red, white, white. So yeah, you're not splashing this card. This is a Boros card through and through. It's a legendary human warrior at rare. It's a 6/1, and it attacks each combat if able. 4 mana 6/1 that trades for anything? Well, sometimes this card is invincible, and that's the idea. It's Achilles, right? So this is a little weird. It says as it enters the battlefield, choose 2, 3, or 4 at random. So you're just going to randomly choose one of those 3 numbers. And then Haktos has protection from each converted mana cost other than the chosen number. And that includes numbers that aren't 2, 3, or 4. So if you randomly choose 2, then Haktos has protection from 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 0, blah, 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 blah. It has protection from everything except for the number 2, or whatever number you chose at random. So that could randomly just win you a game. If your opponent doesn't have a 2 mana answer to Haktos, or a 2 mana creature that can trade off, or something along those lines, then Haktos is basically invulnerable. It's really hard to kill. It can get -1/-1, so if there are ways to shrink a creature without targeting it, Haktos is just gonna bite a bullet. And if your opponent has literally any creature at all that matches the mana cost that you chose at random, then Haktos has to attack, and it's probably just going to trade off. So it's it's kind of dumb to say, but that's the Achilles heel of this card, right? Whatever number you chose, your opponent's going to go out of their way to make sure they have something that can deal with Haktos. And sometimes you choose 3 at random, and they have a 3 mana removal spell, and Haktos just dies. But I think this card is something you should be running in your Boros deck, on account of sometimes it's just going to win you the game because your opponent can't interact with it. The sweet spot here, I think, is 4, because your opponent's less likely to have 4 mana answers or 4 mana creatures, or at least they're more likely to have 2s and 3s. So Haktos seems pretty sweet to me. Not a card I think I'm first picking, but a card that you can get past if you're in red-white, because other people just can't splash this card. Next up is Elspeth, Sun's Nemesis. Look, we can talk about Elspeth all day. The card is clearly just very, very good in basically any white deck, but it's maybe at its best in in white-red, because it pumps multiple creatures, and it creates multiple creatures. So for nuance's sake, we will go ahead and read her. She is 2 white for a 5 loyalty mythic planeswalker. -1, up to 2 target creatures you control each get +2/+1 until end of turn. So note that that does not trigger your heroic because it is an ability and you have to cast spells to trigger heroic. So don't get super fancy there, but +2/+1 on 2 target creatures is already good enough. -2, create 2 1/1 white human creatures, human soldier creature tokens. So -2 to go ahead and build out your board. And notice that Elspeth only minuses, so it's not too hard to play her. -2, -2, -1, and then she dies, but you made 4 tokens and you pumped 2 of your creatures on the last swing. And then -3 says you gain 5 life. You don't care too much about that, but it is a nice little extra ability. Her power is really in the -2 and -1. And since she doesn't have any plus abilities, she's going to die at some point, and she has escape for 4 white and exile and 4 other cards from your graveyard. So any long game and any prolonged game that goes on past turn 6 or 7, Elspeth is probably going to win you that game just on account of being able to come back, being able to produce more tokens, being able to go wide. And I think red-white is the natural home for her just because those tokens are better in this archetype than they are going to be in just a random other white archetype. Archon of Sun's Grace. Look, this is just a generically powerful white bomb, but it does create tokens, so I gave it the nod in red-white over some of the other archetypes, even though, look, it's a constellation card as well, so this card is just busted. Let's read it. Archon of Sun's Grace is 2 white for a 3/4 flying lifelink creature that, wait for it, gives your other Pegasus creatures a lifelink? Oh, it is not a Pegasus itself. It is an Archon, so it just gives Pegasus creatures lifelink. Sure, there's a couple other Pegasuses. If only there was a way to make Pegasus tokens. Oh, right. Constellation says whenever an enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, create a 2/2 white Pegasus creature token with flying. Look, you don't need to be in the heroic red-white deck for this card to be absolutely amazing and win the game basically on its own, but anything that can take advantage of putting multiple bodies on board is worth the nod here. So we're going to mention Archon of Sun's Grace here and probably mention again in some of the enchantment-based strategies in this set because this card is ridiculous. And that's going to go ahead and do it. So that covers green-red, that covers white-red, and we've already covered blue-red, so I figured for the next video we'll go ahead and veer away from red a little bit, and let's talk about some of the black archetypes. So we'll be looking at black-white auras and black-green escape next time, which I think are very well-defined archetypes within the format. Once we get to the last couple videos, you'll notice we start talking about some archetypes that seem a little bit loose and don't really have a well-defined theme to them, so those ones are going to be a little bit quicker because there's not a lot of actual payoff cards. But the next one, there should be quite a bit to talk about, and I hope that this has been helpful for you. Again, you can let me know in the comments below or on Twitter at MTG_ManaRocks if these sorts of videos have done anything to get you ready for a pre-release or your first draft or first sealed event. I would love to hear any feedback that you have. So again, thanks for watching. My name is Timothy here with ManaRocks, and I will see you all in the next one.